much more powerful. He ran the Senate. He was not Ron Paul on domestic issues, but he was an anti-imperialist, an anti-militarist. He wanted to radically defund the military and stop the building of more and more ships. You know, that the United States was building up its Navy, as were the other powers, at the same time that they were outlawing war. He was against foreign warfare and empire, and he was depicted as, you know, the right wing or the isolationist side of the peace movement. And so there's at least some superficial similarity between those two guys. And then the other similarity is that there was a coalition formed between people who resembled Bora and people who wanted to make all sorts of alliances with European and other foreign nations, where today there are sometimes coalitions made between, you know, those of us who want to cut back the crazy military spending in order to spend it on useful things, and those who want to cut back the crazy military spending in order to, you know, give it back to the people who paid their taxes. And so, you know, it is always useful to be able to form coalitions around something you agree on with people you disagree with on lots of other things. And so if those, you know, progressives who want peace can align with those libertarians who want peace on the question of ending a war or defunding the military budget, I think they should do so, and I think we're stronger when we do so. And I think it's easier to do so if we stop identifying ourselves as Obama lovers or Ron Paulers, or, you know, of course you can't be an Obama lover and be in the peace movement at all, but you know, when you identify yourself with a person, then you just have endless arguments over all those points that you disagree on. And so if we make it about policy, and we make it agreements on those points where we do agree, and we even make compromises and negotiations where, you know, we'll back this if you back that. I mean, it's all useful if it makes us stronger.
You said something like, well, maybe we can agree with libertarians that lower taxes is still better than military industrial complex, which could be true, but what are the pitfalls of that?
Well, I mean, we may be hard up against this question in a week here, but I would rather, I mean, especially if the tax cuts were for the bottom 90% of us, you know, I would much rather have less money going into the government at all if it were not going into the war machine. At this point, about 65% of discretionary spending is going into the war machine in one way or another. The Pentagon, the nukes, the mercenaries, the State Department, the security state, you know, where half the cuts are supposed to come from, supposedly, if the super committee doesn't come up with something else and they don't change the rules. 65%. You know, this has doubled in terms of percentage and in terms of real dollars in the past decade. This is insanity. We're spending more on nukes than in the Cold War. We're spending more on every form of war. We have, you know, dozens of times the number of admirals and, you know, a huge Navy in comparison to World War II, when they were actually using the Navy. Right? I mean, it's waste, it's corruption, it's profiteering, and it's more damaging to the economy than tax cuts. But just on the economic argument, it would be far better than tax cuts to take that money and put it into green energy or jobs or infrastructure or education. You know, that would be far, far superior. But, you know, I'll take halfway. You know, the problem, of course, is that once you've done tax cuts, doing tax increases is the very hardest thing. Might even be harder than cutting the military. So you may be stuck with that halfway step. But you know, on the other side, you'll hear Ron Paul himself and many libertarians say, I would rather give everybody health coverage than have these bases all over the world. So, you know, they see it as, they see what we want as better than the status quo as well. And maybe there's compromise. Put half of it into tax cuts for working people and put half of it into useful, nonviolent spending, and come back to the argument for really why we want that, which is that we don't want to put our money into killing human beings, which is really what drove the peace movement in the 20s.
I'm trying to understand the different cultural place we are now compared to where we were in the 20s. And it seems to be well tied into globalism as well, but it seems like there's a lot of the conflict between capitalism and socialism around the world that is motivating the forces that maintain our militaristic culture. Do you address that issue?
Well, somewhat in my previous two books,
Yeah,
not so much in this book where I don't go into
Like the connections.
the present day very much. I stick with 1918 to 1928 with some lessons on what was good activism.
But in terms of the comparison, you mentioned in the talk that the book was about what we can learn about what things were there prior to where we are today. It seems like that's one of the things that the difference that we have to take into account.
This is pre-New Deal, right? This is pre-international mega conglomerates. This is a whole different world in terms of socialism and in terms of capitalism.
That's what I'm talking about. If we want to take lessons from that, it seems like we need to deal with that reality. I mean, for example, there's so many places where there's never mentioned as a motivation. It's always human rights and defense. But places like the Middle East, I mean, many of those countries were far more socialist than we have imposed in our effort to put a government there, nation building, with capitalist nation building to replace some pretty impressive socialist systems. Haiti is another prime example, as well as the one we were fighting for. I think that's part of the picture that describes the issue of how we apply the kellogg-briand pact and the culture that it came out of to our situation today.
Well, I don't want to paint the 1920s as paradise or perfection either, right? And the hypocrisy in the empire building went back at least to 1898 when we started grabbing Cuba and the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Hawaii and Guam and when you look at a map of the globe and who signed on to the Kellogg-Briand Pact, almost every nation is shaded one color or another, but some are the nations that signed and some are their colonies and territories and possessions, right? And there's no discussion of the fact that nations oppressed by the threat of war are thought of as having signed on to a treaty banning war with the rest of the world, right? It was the wealthy nations that did this, and yet the exceptions. The only real exceptions that didn't sign on at all, and some of whom still haven't, were a number of countries in Latin America who understood that the United States considered the Monroe Doctrine to make war in this hemisphere defensive and acceptable by definition. And so there was always hypocrisy. Just as there was hypocrisy in the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights, but this was a step. People still go back and honor those first laws from Moses and before him that went against killing and theft. And we still have killing and theft. this was one of the first laws that really went against war. And it did it while the United States was making war in Nicaragua, threatening it in Mexico. When Kellogg got on the boat in New York to go sign the treaty in Paris, he was protested by anti-imperialists, and I would have been there with them, you know, because you had to push hardest for the best you could get. But now that that's on the books, and we are here and now, you know, we ought to celebrate it. I would like to see a national holiday on August 27th to celebrate the Kellogg-Briand Pact and make people aware of it. And I don't know if I'm answering your question at all, but
May I interject something?
let's have somebody who hasn't yet, and then over to you.
I think, well, I had two, but I think you kind of got it what I was looking at, and I'll read the book, obviously. But I did have a question about just how nations were preparing for war and the armaments they had. I know in Europe that was a big issue at that time. And, you know, of course, now we have our military-industrial complex and how much, you know, this preparation for war played into this outlawing war concept.
Well, there were those who wanted to address war making by disarming and by negotiating disarmament with other nations. And these included people like Senator Bora, who wanted to, you know, call a 5-year pause in building more ships and so forth. And there were endless disarmament conferences in Europe and in Washington that didn't work. You know, they had perfected the art of lying to each other about what they were going to not build and calling it something else and building that. And so at the same time that we outlawed war, we built more weapons, and others built more weapons. It was only those policies that fit with U.S. exceptionalism that, you know, didn't entangle us with other nations that would go through, and those included the Kellogg-Briand Pact and further militarization, building more ships. And so people look back on that and they see the Kellogg-Briand Pact as weak. That was the best they could do. They couldn't do the League of Nations. And there were, if it had not been for the principled peace advocates who saw the League of Nations as a way to war, they would have done the League of Nations. And looking back, those people look like they were very wise. You know, the League of Nations did not work. The United Nations has not worked. NATO has not worked. You know, all have done some good and some bad, but there was ongoing construction of more weapons by these countries. You know, not anything remotely comparing to today, but and not anything remotely comparing to the spending before and during World War I. There was not yet this sense of permanent warfare. You know, I mean, up through World War I, as with all previous wars, you had huge taxation and spending to build an army and fight a war, and then took it back again, not quite as far as where it had been before. And that was true even with World War II and with Korea, and it was, you know, only with Vietnam that LBJ didn't get around to trying to pay for it until nobody liked it, and it was only with Iraq and Afghanistan that we started cutting taxes on billionaires while spending on wars, reversing the traditional approach. But, you know, it's been since World War II, not the interwar period, that we've had the really massive military spending. This should be the last one if nobody else.
I just wanted to speak to something, because I think one of the things that this gentleman just raised the question, I think, was the beginning with the Russian Revolution, and early, there was a pronounced fear of Soviet communism, and which is probably the rationale, at least in my mind, is the least one of the rationales for the rise of Nazi national socialism. So that was a major factor in people's thinking back in those days. And I think if we're going to have discussions like this, we ought to maybe take into consideration what people were thinking. There was a lot of, or even more importantly, how it was affecting their lives.
Well, it certainly comes into the book.
I mean,
and
I'm thinking of the Wilson administration rounding up radicals of all stripes and deporting them or imprisoning people, et cetera, and just, it has, to my mind, I guess to my mind, I would like to hear maybe more, how to say it? I guess when we're talking about the world, and we're not talking about a world that's devoid of elements, strident elements. That are stirring things up, other factors. It's not, in other words, to me, it's not just as simple as the good guys against the bad guys.
well, I should hope nobody ever saw any conflict in this world as simple or between good guys and bad guys. But the threat of communism does come up in the book and was a huge factor, of course, during this period and subsequently in terms of U.S. and Wall Street support for Nazism in Germany, which, Germany had been very much for peace and had ended, and yet the Nazis were seen as preferable to the communists. And in these trials that I described in Nuremberg after World War II, some of these trials dragged on and on, some against important leaders of industry in Germany, and eventually they were acquitted to all appearances because it was seen as preferable, as it had been before the war, to have a stronger Germany to counter the communist threat. So it was certainly a factor. In fact, during the negotiations in the mid-20s, some of these disarmament conferences, the foreign minister of the Soviet Union proposed to the European and United States and the Asian nations absolute disarmament by all parties. We will all, and he was deadly serious, we will all eliminate all weaponry and end all wars. We will destroy and burn and bury everything. And none of the other nations paid the slightest interest in what it was a non-starter.
When was this?
Well, it's in the book. I'm pretty sure it's in the book in some detail, but in the mid-20s. On that cheerful note, but something that maybe we can dig up and make use of. Thanks for coming